We are back with another 20 album roundup, and this time we're looking at pretty much all metal music. There was a lot of metal music that has come out within the past couple of months, and I figured let's just concentrate on the metal stuff. Let's just dive into the heavy stuff. So that's what we've got today. We've got 20 albums to look at, and these are all albums that came out, I believe, within this year. There's going to be some familiar faces on here, probably a lot of stuff that you might not know about, and that's kind of what I'm hoping for. I'm hoping for, a mixture of the familiar as well as the new. So as with all of these, I've left the time code down below for anybody that wanted to skip ahead to look at like a specific album that you were looking for. But I encourage everybody to watch the whole thing because you'll probably find something that you never knew existed, just kind of based on what I'm saying. So these aren't going to necessarily be full-length album reviews. They're just going to be kind of quick first impressions, kind of broad brush strokes, rather than a deep dive into like my usual reviews or analysis in that case as well. Also, if you could help promote this video a little bit, there's a lot of work that goes into these 20 album roundups, and basically I am reducing my time spent on the longer album reviews to do these things, and they're not getting that kind of same traction that I was hoping for. So if you can engage with the video, like, comment, subscribe, that would really mean the world for me. It also helps push this video out to more people that don't know that I exist. So yeah, we're kind of all in this together in that case. So that all being said, we're going to go alphabetically by band, and we're just going to dive into it. So let's get started. Aborted with their latest album, Vault of Horrors. So I think that alone should give you enough information of whether or not you're going to like this album. This is some gnarly death metal. This is some of the harshest of the harsh, some meaty AF that I have heard pretty much all year. It's got some insane riffs on the guitars, incredible blast beats, and those harsh vocals that could shatter glass. I was listening to this and all I wanted to do was the lawnmower, where you're just kind of like downward fisting the whole time, just trying to start that lawnmower as the big chugs are going, as the big breakdowns are happening. Yeah, this one is extremely harsh and insane, so take that with a grain of salt. Sometimes it is a little sizzle over the substance, but I'm okay with that because all of the sounds that I was hearing was a lot of fun at the end of the day. And, when you're looking at a fireworks display, sometimes you don't necessarily need all that depth, all that, dense type of music. Sometimes you just want that sizzle, and that's what we've got. Now, because of that, I know this one's not for everybody. I get that. But if you're looking for that intense death metal, the kind that you want to blast that can, pummel concrete and shatter glass, this one's definitely for you. And that was Aborted by Vault of Horrors. Alterium with their album of War and Flames, and I think that's how you pronounce it, Alterium. This is an Italian power symphonic metal, kind of in the same vein as like a Nightwish or an Epica or an Apocalyptica or anything like that, and it does pack a pretty powerful punch. That's always fun to say, packs a pretty powerful punch, and it's not just kind of like a copy and paste that we've had from bands like this in the past, where they take a very popular act from the past. We've got the Evanescence, and we've got the Epica and the Nightwish, and then we have like a 1,000 clone bands like that. I feel like there's a little bit more of a personal flair on this one. There's something that generally sets it apart, and a lot of that does come from the Italian landscape that this album comes from. I've dipped my toe into the Italian prog from the 70s, and you can kind of hear a little bit of the overlap on that. But I will also say it is kind of true that fans of Nightwish and other symphonic power metal bands like Symphony X, Epica, and Apocalyptica will definitely find overlap in that sense. So if you're looking for, something vastly different or something that breaks the mold, you're not necessarily going to find it on this one, but you will find it quite satisfying to your tastes. As I mentioned, it does have a very unique touch through the lead vocalist of Nicoletta Rossellini, I believe is how you pronounce her name. And specifically, I found very much enjoyment on the harmonizations that Nicoletta is providing to this. So in the end, this was great fun, and if you're looking for some solid power symphonic metal, you're going to find it here. So that was Alterium with their album of War and Flames. Brodequin, I believe that's what it is, Brodequin, with Harbingers of Woe, another really gnarly one. This is their first album in like 20 years. So they're back with their insane pig squealing type of tortured death metal. Again, right there, that's all you really need to know, whether you're, ooh, let me hear more, or no, thank you, next. So we've got guitars that are heavy AF, that don't necessarily go a mile a minute, but they definitely lay the foundation for some extremely heavy moments. The vocals are gnarly as hell. It reminds me of, like, I always think of this as like this sink near the end of its drain where it's just like, I can't do it because I'm not a professional vocalist in that sense, but that kind of like drain. So good luck trying to understand half the lyrics on here. You might want a lyric sheet if that's your thing. This album has moments of drony that I really, really enjoy. You know, you've got a little bit of a slug in there. There's that drone that I really appreciate with this style of music, but it never gets monotonous. You know, it never gets same over and over and over again. There are some times where I feel as if the tracks do drag on for just a little bit, but luckily there's always some kind of a shift to it to get to something new and exciting that leaves me from getting bored. You know, like, I'm always interested, even if I start to think, well, I think we've kind of been here for just a little long, you know. So if you're looking for something insane, intense, and brutal from the masters of the craft after about 20 years of hiatus, then this one's for you. You know, this kind of reminds me of Gospel's record from a couple of years ago with The Loser, you know, a band that had been on hiatus for like 20 odd years and then comes back with just a home run. So outstanding work, and you're going to know whether or not you're going to like this after about 5 minutes, or 5 seconds rather, of listening to this record. So yeah, that's Brodequin with their album of Harbingers of Woe. Dragonforce with their album Warp Speed Warriors. So I have a huge like paragraph of notes, or at least like a full page of notes for this album. And, you know, I just feel as if this album doesn't warrant that much attention. You know, I think the last album from Dragonforce that I really truly enjoyed was back in 2008 with the Ultra Beatdown. And I've kind of kept my finger on the pulse for Dragonforce ever since then. You know, it just, for me, it was just they kept pumping out the same album over and over and over again, and I just wasn't all that impressed or excited, even though I really do love their first couple of albums, you know. So yeah, even with that, and I've heard people say like these last couple of albums have been Disney Force, and yeah, that's a very appropriate name. If you haven't really had your finger on the pulse for a Dragonforce album in the last 10 or 20 years, you're not really missing anything. Like, this isn't quite the top shelf stuff. Now, what brought me to this album, and the thing that I thought was going to be really interesting, was their cover of Taylor Swift. Yeah, even with their Wildest Dreams, which is one of my favorite Taylor Swift tracks, it just fell flat. You know, it just felt weird. And like most of these tracks, if I take that Wildest Dreams take aside, they're mostly forgettable. They're mostly the usual wankery that we've heard from these boys, but they're not as innovative. They're not as exciting. And like, I'm almost at the point now where I'm like, was Dragonforce ever really good? You know, like, I used to love these guys when I was in high school, and it really got me thinking, what, did I ever actually like these guys? This one I would steer clear of. I would just go back to the heyday that was, you know, the Ultra Beatdown, the Valley of the Damned, and the Inhuman Rampage, and Ultra. Just revisit those ones. You're going to find much better music there. So yeah, it's definitely, I can't even say I'm disappointed because of the last handful of records that we've got from Dragonforce, but I was just kind of, you know, hoping for a little bit more. So that was Dragonforce with their album Warp Speed Warriors. Intimate Plan with their album A Surfacing Life. So this is a debut record from a new band, and it's fine. It's fine. You know, we've had a lot of really outstanding debut albums in the last couple of years, and so whenever a new one comes out, I always get pretty excited, but I feel as if the bar for new bands has been raised pretty substantially. This one has flavors of Tool, specifically within the vocals and the guitars. There are moments that emulate that style pretty heavily, but they never really get to the same kind of heights that I love with a good Tool track. Now, luckily, they do break away from their influences every once in a while, and they dabble in the major chord, which I really appreciate. I always thought that Tool would sound really interesting in a major chord, very similar to Between the Buried and Me. And I wonder if at this point they're still kind of struggling to find their own identity, because they are latching on to a lot of the modern progressive rock bands like Coheed and Cambria, like Pain of Salvation, and like Porcupine Tree. I'm feeling a lot of those influences on here without it really bringing anything new to the table. It kind of reminds me of like the Anchoret last year, which had a lot of Porcupine Tree and Opeth homages and sounds to it. But they didn't, unlike the Anchoret, these guys here of Intimate Plan doesn't really advance the music. There's this one-way conversation happening instead of a dialogue. So I'm really hoping that they, on their sophomore record, because there are moments on here that I really do enjoy. I just wish that they were more stay power on here. I wish that there was a few more moments that had a little bit of like a catch to them, like something that I could hold on to and really like get catchy within it. But there are still moments on here that are quite powerful and quite really good. So that's why I'm hoping that a sophomore record, their second one, they'll kind of take what they learned from this one, have that first record under their belt, and then move on and kind of do their own thing. Because I feel like that's when this album really shines and where this band is really, really going to shine. So I would check this one out if you're, looking for something in the prog metal landscape that isn't too heavy. If the harsh vocals or the blast beats or the million miles a second on the guitars kind of, takes away from the enjoyment, then this is more up your sleeve. Like if you love the Coheed and Cambria, if you like the Pain of Salvation, if you like the Porcupine Trees, then you're going to enjoy this one. And I would check it out. And that was Intimate Plan with their album, A Surfacing Life. Eternal Storm and their album, A Giant Bound to Fall. This one was really, really good. I really enjoyed this one. This one, I think the thing that I like more about this album is the vibe and the atmosphere about this, more than I think anything that's actually being presented on here. This is an album that I think I love the whole more than the like components and the sum of its parts, something along those lines. It has some great chugging in the guitars without blasting down the doors the entire time. The balance between the harsher notes and the softer side of things is immaculate. It is handled very, very well. Sometimes it can feel like, you're in the harsher side of things and then you just run into a brick wall and it's just like, oof. And other times it can feel like, you're in this really slow chug that then suddenly you're just catapulted out of nowhere. So I really like how they're able to handle both sides of the spectrum in that case. If you're looking for some more doomy metal with flavors of black metal thrown in, just for some good taste, I think you're really going to enjoy this one and you're really in for a treat. The opening track on this album is still my favorite, and not just because it's the longest. It's the play out at the end of this track that just got me so excited. So yeah, this one I would recommend. I would give this one a spin. This is definitely, if you're kind of a fan of the kind of proggy death metal side of things, then give this one a spin. And that was Eternal Storm with their album, A Giant Bound to Fall. Judas Priest and their latest album, Invincible Shield. So, Judas Priest, the masters and grandfathers of heavy metal music. I gotta be honest, I've never been a big fan of Judas Priest. I think out of all those like big metal outfits from the 80s, I'm much more of a Metallica or Iron Maiden fan. But there are still some tracks that I really enjoy, even though I don't really dig deep into there. Like, I just keep thinking of like Breaking the Law, and I'm like, yeah, That's fine. That's cute. But honestly, I feel as if this album, and especially like their last album, I believe it was called Firepower or something like that, really, really surprised me. Like this is kind of in the same camp that like Uriah Heep and Deep Purple and Styx have found themselves in. You know, like those 70s bands that are still pumping out some of their best music to date. Like the last albums from all three of those bands were some of the best music that those bands have done since the 70s. And Judas Priest, honestly, is kind of doing the exact same thing, especially with their last album and this album here. Like, it's bringing me back to the vibes of that really harsh, really heavy metal music. You know, that I feel as if bands nowadays are trying to overcompensate with down tuning or, you know, the 8-string guitars and just kind of like dropping that final note and all the chugging and all the gent styles. And I mean, I enjoy that. I mess around with that really heavily, but I feel like, you know, you throw a stone and you'll hit 5 of those bands. Judas Priest is showing you like you can be that heavy without needing all of those techniques. You know, they're showing like we are just using the techniques that we have mastered in the 80s now, and we are still making some really heavy, really powerful music, and I really, really appreciate that. This is some of my favorite music that I've heard from Judas Priest. Like it's funny. Before I sat down to listen to this record, I sat back and I listened to like the top 5 tracks off of Spotify from Judas Priest, and like nothing on this album is worse than any of those 5 tracks. And in fact, I like all the tracks off of here more than any of those big tracks. So yeah, if I had to like really think about something to criticize about this album, and I hate to do it, but it's kind of part of the job here, is that I feel as if this album is just a little too long. I know I listened to the deluxe version, so I'm sure that there was a couple of extra tracks on there, but like I feel as if this album should have been about like 45 minutes. 45 minutes would have been perfect, but what we got was about over an hour worth of music, and I was just a little, by the end, it was just a little bit of same. You know, it was just a little of the same stuff over and over and over again. But the thing that I just can't get enough of is like the shredding on the guitars. Like, sure, this guy isn't going like a mile a minute, but everything is so catchy. Like everything is so dang catchy off of this album. I can't help but love. So yeah, this one gets a really solid recommendation for me. If you haven't checked it out yet, I highly recommend doing so. And it's that kind of accessible metal that I feel like anybody that enjoys metal music as a whole would still love this. You know, like it might not necessarily be the harshest things, but those harsh, guttural death metal, you know, fanboys will still love this. And those who like, you know, a little bit of the softer stuff, a little bit more of the accessible stuff, it's catchy enough to also, you know, not be turned off by it. So yeah, this one gets a really big recommendation, and that was Judas Priest album, Invisible Shield. Lascaile's Shroud with their album Wyrmfire and Starlight. And I really hope I got that. Lascaile's, I think is how you pronounce it. This is a prog metal album, and I mean both in solidness. I was trying to figure out what I was trying to say. But this is a solid progressive metal record. And I mean both of those in the totality of those words. It is a single track album at 40 minutes straight. You know, this, and I love a single track record. You know, I have little to no memory. I have little to no memories of these memories from Toehider. 2 years ago was my favorite record, and it was just the single track album. And when I caught into this record, I was wondering if they were going to be able to maintain the amount of energy and the amount of heaviness that they start off with in the first 5 minutes of this. You know, because I was getting flavors of like Dope Smoker from Sleep, where it's very droney. It's a single track at over an hour, but it was very droney, and you didn't have to worry about going a mile a minute. Whereas this track is going a mile a minute. Like, this is a harsh prog metal outfit, and I was shocked and surprised that they were able to maintain that level of like energy without it ever feeling bored or monotonous or repetitive that a lot of these single track albums can fall into. I was a little hesitant when there wasn't a lot of like variety within the dips and valleys of this. There are a couple, and they're smattered throughout, but like we don't get like a big build-up moment. We don't get a theme that's introduced near the beginning, that's then reprised near the middle, and gets revolutionized by the end. This is just like we're going from one passage to another passage to another passage, and it provides some really interesting like landscapes that you are navigating through. My other kind of big hesitation about this record is that I love the ending, but it doesn't feel as grand or as bombastic that I really hoped these types of tracks deliver. And again, not all the big tracks like the single track album have to do that. Like I'm thinking of Thick as a Brick and Passion Play from Jethro Tull. Neither of them have like the big climax near the end, but it does kind of justify the track length. And I never really felt as if this album and this track did that. It's still fine, and I still really, really enjoy it. And I think one of the big highlights of this is using a more of the synths and production side of the work of the album to provide a lot of the rhythms of this album. It gives it a little bit more of like a sci-fi fantasy feel from like the 80s. Like I'm thinking of like Heavy Metal or Wizards, those animated films from the 80s. I really appreciate that. I really love it, but I was just kind of hoping for just a little bit more. So yeah, this is kind of like a light recommendation from me. You'll know again within the first couple of seconds whether or not you're going to enjoy this, because it is harsher vocals, it is harsher music, and you got 40 minutes worth of it. So, kind of buckle yourself in. But if the mood strikes me just right, I love this type of an album. So it's kind of a light recommendation from me. And that was Lascaille's Shroud and their album Wyrmfire and Starlight. Midnight with their record Hellish Expectations. So this is like a punk metal band, and I'm not a big fan of punk metal, or I'm not even a big fan of punk as a general rule of thumb. Like, I appreciate them, I understand the appeal, it's just not necessarily for me. It's part of the reason why I love prog music. But I wish that more punk albums sounded like this, because at least there's quite a bit more musicianship found within this, and a little bit more, substance to it. And I'm not saying that all punk is without its substance. There's a lot of substance, but like I'm thinking of like musically. This is a classic example of two genres blending together and taking the best aspects of each to provide something new. Like it's kind of reminding me of how Rage Against the Machine took the kind of political stance and the messaging of punk and blended it with the energy and the power of metal to create Rage Against the Machine. This is doing something a little bit similar, but they're taking the raw aspect of punk and blending it with the heavier chugs, the soundscapes of metal to create some of their more visceral and engaging music on here. So if you took the power of Motorhead and you put it to the speed of the Ramones, that's kind of the flavor that I'm getting within this one. It's almost as if they took speed metal and then turned it down, or if they took punk and just sped it up a little bit. Instead of having the speed metal at being like 11, they turn it down to maybe about a 7. Like any good punk track, barely any of these songs reach the 3-minute mark. Most of these tracks are like a minute and a half, 2 minutes, and that is perfect for this style of music. Anything that goes beyond like 2.5 minutes in a punk song, I'm like, cut it. We're done. You should have said whatever you came here to say. It is very interesting because a lot of what's on this album is very antithetical to my tastes, but I can at least appreciate the appeal that's found on here. If the tracks were any longer, as I mentioned, past 2.5 minutes, I would be tapping out. I would be like, nope, that's enough. I'm done. So yeah, I would find myself just getting bored and my mind would be drifting. So yeah, it's the perfect length as well as the album proper for what you're getting. So yeah, if you're a fan of speed metal or punk, I would honestly give this one a spin. It was a little bit more enjoyable than I thought for somebody that's not a big fan of punk, such as myself. So yeah, that was Midnight with their album Hellish Expectations. Monovoth with their album Pleroma, Mortem Est. I butchered that, and I know it, and I even took a couple of, swings before I went to the run-up, but There you go. That's why you come to these, to see me butcher band names that aren't American or Canadian. Yeah, this is some great guttural death metal that has some amazing buildups and some great payoffs. This is what I love within the Doom metal, is those buildups and the payoff. And I find with Doom, it's more about the vibes. You know, like if the vibes are good, I will stick with the whole album and I will just listen to it until the record is broken. And I feel like this one has some really great vibes with the added bonus of having those great buildups and payoffs that I really particularly love with a progressive metal album. It's also short and sweet, which is really great as it gives you just enough to get into it, to get the vibes, to get the flavors, but it doesn't linger around so much that you start to get bored or it gets repetitive or it gets monotonous. So it's just the right length so you don't get lost within the sauce in this one. So yeah, if you're looking for some good new doom metal that has some really good vibes, then I think this is a solid entry and I would recommend it. So that is Monovoth with their album. I'm going to try this again. Pleroma Mortem Est. Myrath with their new album of Karma. This is some really interesting like power metal stuff, and you know, you've heard quite a bit of power metal this year, and it has a lot of really interesting flavors kind of swirling around in this. You know, it has the typical power metal, but there's some symphonic metal and a dash of prog metal in here as well. I think what sets these guys apart from your typical run-of-the-mill symphonic power metal prog band is that you've got some really interesting rhythm sections on here that I found myself really grooving towards and being like, ooh, that's some tasting. The drumming and the percussion has some really rich layers that you don't normally see within this style of metal. Sadly though, once those initial flavors are worn off, I do feel as if it's a little bit, I don't know, I don't feel myself getting all that connected with it. It doesn't have that kind of same stay power that a lot of these types of symphonic progressive power metal bands have. And I wonder if it's just like the lack of innovative licks or guitar solos or anything along those lines. You know, I just wasn't all that connected with it. But yeah, I mean, if you're still looking for some fun symphonic power metal, then I would still check this one up. This one might be up your alley. And that was Myrath with their album of Karma. Necrophobic with their new album In the Twilight Gray. This is some black death metal. These guys came out of the woodwork back in the mid-90s. Kind of like when this style of the black death metal was really starting to come out of the woodworks. I feel like these guys were right there, you know, right at the scene. And I feel as if they weren't necessarily like innovators or trailblazers in that sense. But I do feel as if they were kind of like mastering the craft and doing something interesting with something that was already there. And I can appreciate that, you know? I do love the lead singer's vocals. You know, he's been around for a while, and you would expect that with this type of singing style, much like with Judas Priest, I would have thought like this guy's voice would have been deteriorated, but honestly, it is still brutal and it is still harsh and it is still just like commanding, you know? And so I was just like blown away by his vocal works on here. The music overall is fairly simple, which is nice for this style of death metal. Makes it a little bit more approachable. It's not, you know, overlaid or over complex or anything along those lines. And I don't know, I just find this album, it's going to sound so weird considering the type of music that's being found on here, I find it very charming. You know, I feel this album is very, very charming. It's like a relic from the death metal past of like the 90s. You know, it's almost like somebody found this time capsule and unearthed it. And it's like, we haven't been touched by grunge. We haven't been touched by nu metal. We haven't been touched by gent. This is just the solid 90s death metal. And I found myself smiling a lot more than I thought I would with this type of music. So yeah, I would give this one a spin. This one gets the note seal of approval. And that was Necrophobic with their album In the Twilight Gray. NinémiA by the Weapon of Math Destruction, and I believe that's how you pronounce the band's name. This is a prog metal band, and it was a lot of fun. I have to be fully transparent here. I love this record. It has a lot of that fun metal music that I love within a prog band. It's heavy, it's meaty, it has some great interplay between the guitar licks and the solos within it. And honestly, the guitars are some of the best guitar works that I've heard all year. It's a lot more accessible than a lot of other progressive prog metal bands I found because, it's a little bit more concise. It's a little bit more punchy and a lot more accessible in that sense without compromising the longer stretches of music within the individual tracks. Like you still have some very satisfying buildups and payoffs, just within like a little bit more of an accessible package. I highly recommend this one as it's got a great balance between the harsh without being brutal, the meaty without being overly indulgent, and a blend of many different styles of metal without it being a complete slurry of, working parts. It's just kind of like, yeah, these guys have distilled a lot of some of the best qualities of all these different styles without it compromising the overall enjoyment of the music. So yeah, I highly recommend it. I think you should check it out. And that was NinémiA, I believe that's how you pronounce it, with Weapons of Math Destruction. Night Verses with their full-length album, Every Sound Has a Color in the Valley of Night. I reviewed their EP that they put out last year, and, it's about half of the album, so now we get the full-length album. And yeah, if you like last year's EP, you will love the full-length album. It builds on what they started last year. It provides a lot more context for that EP. This is that same kind of, harsher metal prog without it getting brutal, without it getting intense. This is just kind of like straight up metal music that has prog flares. I'm thinking of some of the harsher stuff from like The Ladder, Porcupine Tree, or even Motorpsycho. But I'm thinking of also like King Buffalo and Soup being a little bit more of the indie progressive stuff as well. So yeah. If you like kind of the heavy, a little bit drony, but no points where it ever sludgy or over technical, I think you'll really like this one. It's a great purely instrumental album that's got its dark and menacing moments without it being brutal or technical. So yeah, I honestly would give this one a spin. It built off of what the EP started last year, and that was Night Versus with their album Every Sound Has a Color in the Valley of Night. Notio with their new album Worldview. This is some really interesting, powerful metal music that has kind of like it almost feels like a successor of System of a Down, but played more in like the 80s metal style of music. It's got some really tasty moments, but I will say the highlight really at the end of the day is the vocals. After I listen to this record, I go straight back into System of a Down with Hypnotize and Memorize, as well as some of their, Steal This Album and Toxicity, which is a little bit of a shame because, I want to spend more time with this record, and if I want to go and listen to another album or another band afterwards, it's like, well, did you really do what you were set out to do? I am glad that this record is a little short, as bad as that might sound, as it was basically the perfect amount of music for what the band was putting down. I feel as if it was any longer, it would have started to drag, it would have, been a little bit like overindulgent, and I think the flavor of the music would have just gotten stale. So I'm glad that it didn't linger. Sadly, though, if I'm being perfectly honest, outside of the praises that I could give to the lead singer, who sounds just like Serge from System of a Down, there really isn't that much to write home about at the end of the day for this record. But if you're looking for some straightforward, fun metal music with a little bit of flair, a little bit of like extra garnish, then it's a good time. I can't say anything really bad about this record outside of I wish that there was a little bit more, even though I think it's the perfect length. So I know it's a little contradictory, but that's what I've got. And that's my thought of Notio with their album Worldview. Professor Caffeine and the Insecurities, their self-titled debut record. This is another debut record, and once again, high bar, that's been met. These guys are brilliant. This is your straight up prog metal stuff in the vein of Coheed and Cambria and Thank You Scientists. It's a little bit more jazzy than Coheed and a little bit more poppy than Thank You Scientists, but it kind of blends, the best of both worlds into this one. I love the track Astronaut. I think it's one of my favorite tracks of this year so far. It has a wonderful catchy chorus that gets caught in my head every time I listen to it. And I've only listened to this album like maybe 5 or 6 times, but every single time afterwards, I just can't help but sing this song to myself over and over and over again. I think this is a great first attempt. I think they hit a bullseye, and I'm really excited to hear where they go from here as the songs continue, because I want more. I want more of this. So more Professor Caffeine and the Insecurities, please. Because that's this album. That was their self-titled debut album by Professor Caffeine and the Insecurities. Sonata Arctica with their album Clear Cold Beyond. So, another Sonata Arctica album. I don't even know if I really need to give too much in-depth information about this one. If you've heard a Sonata Arctica record in the past, you've essentially heard this one. They found their formula, they found their box, and they're playing in it quite well. It's some fun northern prog power metal that I always enjoy. You've got lots of fun licks. You've got that really heavy atmosphere about it. It's just a little bit more, it's like your usual Sonata Arctica track. It's just a little bit more. And I always have a good time with Sonata Arctica within their power metal, but I don't know. For me, what I enjoyed about this was because my expectations were a little bit lower, especially after other legacy bands like Dragonforce really not living up to their expectations. This one at least exceeded the expectations for me because the expectations were a little bit lower. It's fun, and I had a fun, the harpsichord moments on this one that I really like in the style of the keyboards on a bunch of the tracks. The vocals are cheesy as grilled cheese sandwich, and the sound is big and fun. They're playing very well within their sandbox, and, those last few tracks, I will say, The Best Things and The Clear Beyond Cold are bangers. That alone is enough for you to check out this album. Just those last few tracks, I think they really knocked it out of the park, and that is where I found the most enjoyment for this record. So, yeah, I would honestly give Sonata Arctica Clear Cold Beyond a listen. So, yeah, that's what I've got for the Sonata Arctica album. Turbulence with their album Binary Dream. I've been loving this one. This is some really great prog metal. I know that a bunch of my friends have been checking it out. I love that it infuses a bunch of electronic sounds within this prog metal style of music. It creates great instrumentals, which sets the stage for some great guitar and keyboard solos and passages. The title track is a great example of a modern progressive rock track, specifically infused with this dripping metal awesomeness. I know I'm very professional within this. I love the big sound that these guys are able to capture. It makes it feel heavier and bigger than a lot of either just straight up metal or just those heavier prog styles would have had that I've heard pretty much all this year. Since most of these songs do bleed into one another, it feels as if it's one unified piece of music, which I really, really appreciate. Again, this is another album that I couldn't get enough of. I just found myself coming back to it. I found myself really digging it, and I really love it. So this one's another one that gets the note seal of approval. I would check this one out, and that was Turbulence with their album Binary Dream. Tvinna 2, Wings of Ember. So this is more of like an indie folk metal album, and I found myself just falling in love with this one. It's very similar to Nightwish, and I know I keep leaning on Nightwish, but they're one of the bigger, female-fronted metal bands. But it's a little bit less gothic chic and a little bit more cottage core. I love the throat singing that is found on a couple of the tracks on here. I thought that was exquisite, and I wish that more bands would do this. This whole album is just a vibe, and one that I've been really getting into this past year. If you're looking for more of like that witchy core, cottage core metal record, then this one is great, and that's exactly what I've been digging and craving. I can't decide what I like more about this, the hauntingly beautiful vocals that are provided throughout this whole album, or the balancing act that they have between the guitars and the keyboards, going back and forth between the two of them. And honestly, this whole balancing act is really shown within the title track of Wings of Ember, and it just exemplifies how brilliant this album is. So can't sing this praise higher. I really love this album. I think you would like it too. And that was Tvinna with their album, or I guess Tvinna 2, Wings of Ember. All right, bringing us to a close, we have Vicinity with their album 8. This one really surprised me. This one kind of came out of nowhere for me, and it's definitely more of the traditional prog metal in the vein of like Dream Theater or Symphony X or any of those like mid to late 90s, early 2000s kind of prog metal groups. They don't fall into that same trap that I felt like a lot of those prog bands, and I was mentioning this in one of the past reviews, where they don't fall into the genty trap or the overly produced drop beats tracks, like these guys. They just stick to their guns and they play very well within it. They have some very tasty tracks opening and closing this album with tracks that are over the 10-minute mark. I was like, oh yes, more of that, please. Num, 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 num. Everybody is playing at top level here as well. The keyboards, the guitars, they're all top shelf, but what I really want to shout out is the drumming that is found on here. Whoever's behind the kit is an absolute beast, and I want to shout them out. There's also some great use of the keyboards, as I mentioned, not only to play within a mile a minute, but also to lay down some amazing atmospheres, very similar to like a Derek Sherinian from Falling into Infinity. I will say, though, at the end of the day, they do feel a little bit like a watered-down Dream Theater, but they add enough to it not being derivative. I feel like they're kind of continuing the flavor of a Falling into Infinity style of the Dream Theater aspect, if they just kind of watered it down just a little bit. But I will say, if you just look to Confusion Reactor and DKE to showcase how they are more than just their influences, I gotta give this one to them. This is another one that I highly recommend. I would check this one out if you're a fan of Dream Theater, you're a fan of Symphony X, you're a fan of those prog metal bands from like mid to late 90s, early 2000s. You're going to get a kick out of this one. So yeah, that was Vicinity with their album of 8, and that brings us to the end of this episode. Those are 20 albums for you guys to check out. I hope you found something that you enjoyed on here. Let me know which albums you've checked out already. Which ones are you excited to check out? Which ones did you enjoy? Let me know all about that by commenting down below. Again, that engagement, that's key. I want to get this out to as many folks as possible. So really do help share this one around, and tell your friends, tell your family, tell random strangers on the street, share this one around. So I hope you found something fun on this one. I really do. I hope you found something fun, and that's where I'm going to leave you. So that all being said, I want to thank you all for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.